There is a corridor at the bottom of the North Atlantic where the water has not meaningfully moved in decades. Not slowed, not reduced. Genuinely, chemically still suspended inside a wreck, the ocean has been actively dismantling for over 100 years. At 3,800 meters below the surface, in total darkness, under pressure that would collapse a human body in milliseconds, there is a pocket of water that belongs to an entirely different system than the one surrounding it. Something quieter, something that should not, by any physical logic, still be here. The water inside that corridor has been transforming in isolation for decades, not because anything is protecting it, but because the collapsed geometry of a dying ship has created, entirely by accident, a space where the rules of the open ocean no longer apply. But this is not stillness. It is a system held under pressure by a structure that is failing. And when the boundary finally gives, the response will not ease in gradually. It will arrive like a chemical detonation, sudden, total, irreversible. The ship created a boundary. The ocean has been working to erase it ever since, and the boundary is almost gone. To understand what is being erased, you first have to understand what the deep North Atlantic actually is, because most people imagine it wrong. The common assumption is stillness. Cold, dark, motionless. And it is cold. Temperature at 3,800 meters holds near 2 degrees Celsius year-round, with almost no seasonal variation whatsoever. Pressure at this depth exceeds 380 atmospheres, compressing every void, slowing every molecular exchange, altering the way gases dissolve and the way chemistry unfolds at a fundamental level. At the surface, a reaction that takes minutes might take days down here. A process that takes days might stretch across decades. Time does not stop in the deep ocean. It expands, stretching events across timescales that make human intuition nearly useless as a guide. But despite all of that, the deep ocean is not still. It is part of a planetary circulation system, a slow global conveyor of water that moves across entire ocean basins over centuries, carrying dissolved oxygen, heat, and nutrients from one hemisphere to another, from surface to seafloor and back again. At this depth, that flow is not fast, it is not dramatic, you would not feel it, but it is relentless, and it is what delivers the one resource that drives nearly every biological and chemical process at this depth: dissolved oxygen. Where flow exists, oxygen arrives. Where oxygen arrives, reactions precede corrosion, decomposition, respiration, the entire machinery of change. Where flow is interrupted, where some structure forces the water to stop moving, the oxygen already present is consumed and not replaced. And when that happens, the rules of chemistry do not bend. They break. Entirely different processes take over, governed by entirely different organisms, producing entirely different outcomes. That is the world the Titanic sank into in April of 1912. And that is the world that has been systematically reclaiming it ever since, one collapsed boundary at a time. The wreck does not sit passively inside that system. It interrupts it actively, structurally, in hundreds of distinct locations simultaneously. A ship 269 meters long with thousands of individual compartments, corridors, stairwells, sealed voids, and collapsed decks is not just an obstacle the ocean flows around. It is a machine for creating conditions that would not otherwise exist, a machine that has been running without maintenance for over a century. Some sections of the wreck are fully open to the surrounding ocean. The bow has fractured and shifted under its own weight, penetrated by decades of natural collapse. And in those exposed regions, water moves with relatively little resistance. The ocean passes through almost as if the ship were not there, and the chemistry inside those open spaces is nearly identical to the chemistry of the surrounding seafloor. But the first-class deck is different. It is a fragmented labyrinth, some pathways wide, some narrowed to centimeters by panels of shifted steel, some sealed almost entirely by structural collapse that occurred years or decades ago. What used to be a corridor designed for passengers in formal dress lit by electric chandeliers, carpeted from wall to wall, is now a fluid trap. A geometry that slows the movement of water until the chemistry inside begins to pull away from the chemistry outside, slowly at first, then decisively, then irreversibly. The ship has stopped being a structure and has become a condition, a set of physical constraints that the ocean must now navigate, work around, and given enough time, given enough structural failure, work through. The wreck is not resisting the ocean. It is, without knowing it, shaping the ocean's behavior. And the ocean is noting every weakness and waiting. On the exterior of the wreck, the ocean is doing what it does everywhere at this depth, and it is not gentle. Dissolved oxygen in the surrounding seawater reacts continuously with exposed steel, driving a persistent, self-sustaining cycle of oxidation that has no natural endpoint. The current, even at this depth, even at this pace, is sufficient to carry corrosion products away from the surface as they form, which constantly exposes fresh metal beneath, which sustains the reaction. Iron gives up electrons to oxygen, rust forms, the current strips it away, fresh iron is exposed, and the cycle begins again with no pause and no mercy. On top of that electrochemical process, biology has layered its own machinery, and what that machinery has built is remarkable. Iron-oxidizing bacteria, microorganisms that extract energy directly from the chemical transformation of iron, have colonized the outer hull in densities that researchers found almost difficult to comprehend on first observation. They construct what oceanographers call rusticles, long reddish-brown formations that drape from the hull like frozen waterfalls, like the ship is slowly bleeding into the water around it. Each rusticle is not decoration. It is a biological processing unit, a structured, layered colony of microorganisms that grows outward from the surface, extracts energy from the iron beneath it, and eventually collapses under its own weight, only to begin growing again from the same site. Conservative estimates suggest that the combined biological and chemical activity on the exterior surfaces of the wreck consumes somewhere between 100 and 200 kilograms of iron every single day. At that rate, the hull, as a recognizable structure, may have decades, not centuries, before it can no longer support its own form. The exterior of the Titanic is not decaying. It is being dismantled deliberately, efficiently, by a system that has no concept of historical significance and no interest in slowing down. Move inside those partially enclosed spaces, and the process begins identically and then diverges in ways that rewrite every assumption about what is happening in there. Water enters carrying its dissolved oxygen, just as it does everywhere along the exterior. Microbial communities establish themselves on the metal surfaces and begin consuming that oxygen through respiration and chemical activity, the same way they do outside. But outside, the oxygen is continuously replenished by the movement of water. New oxygenated water arriving, spent water moving on. Inside, that replenishment slows to a rate that cannot keep pace with consumption. Oxygen concentrations begin to fall. The organisms that depend on aerobic metabolism on oxygen as their terminal electron acceptor begin to fail. They consume what is available, produce their metabolic waste, and then face a resource that is no longer being restored. Some die. Others enter states of reduced activity. And the chemistry of the water, which was indistinguishable from the surrounding ocean when it first entered this space, begins to transform along a trajectory entirely its own. Diffusion becomes the dominant mechanism of exchange, the slow, passive drift of molecules from regions of higher concentration toward regions of lower concentration. And diffusion across even a few meters of stagnant water is so slow that the interior effectively decouples from the exterior over time. Two chemically distinct environments now exist within the same physical space, separated not by walls, most of those are gone, but by the simple, absolute logic of flow rate. What the ocean is doing 2 meters away has become almost entirely irrelevant to what is happening inside. The inside and the outside are no longer in conversation with each other. And that silence is what makes the interior so strange and so fragile. At the boundary between those two environments, a gradient forms, oxygen-rich water pressing inward from the exterior, oxygen-depleted water holding its position on the interior side. And this is where the dynamic shifts from decay into something that more accurately resembles a slow-motion siege, because that boundary is not fixed, it is moving. Every time a structural element fails, every time a panel buckles, a joint separates, a beam that has been corroding from the inside out finally gives way. Oxygenated water pushes further into spaces that had adapted to its absence. And when that happens, the word intrusion is not an overstatement. These are oxygen intrusion events, and their consequences inside the affected space are not gradual. The microbial communities that had reorganized themselves around the complete absence of oxygen, the anaerobic specialists that had, over years or decades, converted that space into a functioning low-oxygen ecosystem, are suddenly exposed to a compound that is, to them, acutely toxic. They do not adapt in real time. They collapse. Populations that took years to establish are decimated in a period that may be measured in weeks. The chemistry of the space swings in response. Hydrogen sulfide concentrations crash as the organisms producing it die. pH shifts as the buffering capacity of the water changes. Iron compounds that had been chemically stable under anaerobic conditions begin reacting with the incoming oxygen, accelerating localized corrosion in patterns that are far more aggressive than standard surface oxidation. What appeared, from the outside, to be a stable interior system was never stable at all. It was a pressurized equilibrium held in place entirely by the physical architecture of the ship. The moment the architecture fails, the equilibrium does not transition, it detonates. The materials inside those spaces record this history with a precision that instruments struggle to match. Steel in oxygen-limited zones does not corrode the way it does on the exterior. Instead of surface oxidation spreading evenly across a panel, localized reactions dominate concentrated zones of chemical activity driven by microbial films that establish their own microenvironments directly on the metal, pitting it in patterns that look almost deliberate under magnification. A structural beam that appears intact from a remotely operated vehicle camera may be riddled with microscopic failure channels running through its interior, invisible to observation, progressing toward a threshold at which the beam will fail without any visible precursor. The structural risk from interior corrosion is not well understood, partly because it is so difficult to observe, and partly because the failure mode sudden, without warning, does not lend itself to prediction. Organic materials tell an equally unsettling story. In fully oxygenated exterior zones, wood, textiles, leather, and paper were consumed within years of the sinking. Aerobic decomposers are efficient, thorough, and fast relative to their anaerobic counterparts. But in isolated interior pockets where oxygen has been scarce or absent for decades, fragments of organic material have been documented in states that seem almost impossible given the environment not intact, not preserved in any meaningful sense, but degrading so slowly under anaerobic chemistry that they have outlasted everything that surrounded them. And this is the part that deserves full attention, that persistence is not stability, it is deferred collapse. The moment oxygen re-enters those spaces, the anaerobic processes that were keeping degradation slow are replaced by aerobic ones that are orders of magnitude faster. The material does not continue to decay at the same pace. It accelerates, catching up to where it should have been years or decades ago, sometimes visibly disintegrating within a time frame that researchers have described as striking to witness even in documentation. The biology that drives all of this is not incidental to the process. It is the process itself, the actual mechanism through which the ship is being transformed, the actual force that determines what survives, what collapses, and what the wreck will look like in 50 years. In oxygenated exterior zones, aerobic microbial communities establish the corrosion rates, consume organic matter, and physically determine the surface geometry of the wreck over time. They are building the rusticles, they are stripping the paint, they are consuming the iron. In the oxygen-depleted interior zones, entirely different communities have taken their place. Anaerobic specialists that exploit chemical gradients with a biochemical precision refined across billions of years of evolutionary pressure. Sulfate-reducing bacteria use dissolved sulfate ions as a substitute terminal electron acceptor, producing hydrogen sulfide as their metabolic output, a compound that alters the surrounding chemistry and opens corrosion pathways that have no equivalent in aerobic environments, attacking metals through mechanisms that electrochemical models of standard seawater corrosion do not predict. These organisms are not filling a secondary role. They are the dominant chemical force inside those spaces. They regulate which reactions proceed and which are suppressed. They determine what the interior of the wreck looks like at a molecular level, making decisions in aggregate without intention that cascade upward into structural outcomes. And they are exquisitely, dangerously sensitive to disruption. Every oxygen intrusion event, every collapse that reconnects an isolated interior to the oxygenated exterior does not shift these communities. It replaces them. One ecosystem ends without transition. Another begins without negotiation. What had been organized around absence is consumed by presence, and the wreck that emerges from that reorganization is structurally and chemically different from the wreck that existed the moment before the boundary failed. What is unfolding inside the first-class deck is not a local anomaly. It is a concentrated, human-scale version of processes that govern the chemistry of the entire deep ocean processes that operate at every depth, in every basin, across every boundary where flow is interrupted and gradients are allowed to form. Oxygen minimum zones, regions of the open ocean where biological oxygen consumption has outpaced circulatory replenishment, cover millions of square kilometers and exhibit the same chemical stratification, the same microbial transitions, the same divergence between oxygenated surface layers and depleted interior waters. Deep sediment cores pulled from the seafloor record the same history in chemical layers. Here, aerobic conditions dominated. Here, the oxygen disappeared. Here, sulfate reduction took over. Here, a shift in circulation reconnected the system to oxygenated water, and everything reorganized again. The Titanic is running this experiment in miniature, in a space small enough that researchers can cross the entire gradient in a single dive, observe both ends of the system in the same session, and collect samples from the boundary itself. That accessibility has made the wreck one of the most data-productive natural laboratories in deep-sea science, not despite its historical significance, but entirely independent of it. The data the wreck produces about gradient formation, microbial succession, and structural chemical feedback applies to ocean systems at scales measured in thousands of kilometers. The ship did not become a scientific subject by accident. The ocean made it one by doing what it always does, organizing complexity around every boundary it encounters and generating information in the process. Over time, the balance shifts in one direction only, and it is not toward stability, and it is not toward preservation, and it is not toward anything that resembles the static relic that the popular imagination of the Titanic tends to hold. It shifts toward dissolution. As the steel continues to weaken under the combined pressure of electrochemical corrosion, microbial processing, and the sheer mechanical load of 3,800 meters of water pressing down on a structure that was never designed to bear it, the ship progressively loses its capacity to impose boundaries on the water moving through it. Pathways that once narrowed flow to near zero widen into open channels. Sealed volumes become connected spaces. Oxygen intrusion events become more frequent, more extensive, and more consequential as the structural integrity that had prevented them degrades beyond recovery. The gradients that had defined the interior chemistry, that had maintained the distinction between inside and outside for decades, collapse, one by one, in a sequence that mirrors the sequence of structural failures spreading through the hull. The delayed processes resume, and they do not resume slowly. They accelerate, compensating for the time they were held back, consuming in years what anaerobic conditions had protected for decades. And eventually, not in a single catastrophic moment, but in a long, distributed sequence of small failures and reorganizations, what remains is not a wreck with internal chemistry. It is a surface, a reef-shaped artifact with topography but no interior, no gradients, no biological distinction between inside and outside. Just ocean, moving the way it always has, through a space that used to impose conditions on it and no longer can. The first-class deck of the Titanic was never being preserved. It was always being reclaimed, one intrusion event at a time, one failed boundary at a time, one collapsed ecosystem at a time. We tend to think of the ocean as something that erodes, that wears things down gradually, that dismantles structure through the accumulation of small forces over long time. But that is not quite right. The ocean does not erase the boundaries that form inside a wreck. It does something more patient than that. It waits for the structure that created them to fail. And the structure always fails, and the ocean is always still there, moving when it does. If this is the kind of story that holds your attention, the intersection of physical history, deep science, and the strangeness of what lies beyond the reach of light, subscribe to Sunken Realms Deep. New episodes every week. There is so much more waiting beneath the surface.